My beloved child, scrolling for a moment. There are times when a story arrives with such perfect timing that it feels as though it has been patiently waiting for your heart to become quiet enough to hear it. Do not rush past these words. Something within this tale may echo a question you have been carrying for longer than you realize. What you are about to hear was meant to find you, not because it predicts your future, but because every heart searching for hope deserves a story that reminds it how powerful honesty can be. The morning in this story began unlike any other, before the world had fully awakened, while the first light gently stretched across the horizon and the ordinary sounds of life were still finding their rhythm. Someone you deeply loved found themselves unable to carry a silent burden any longer. Their heart had become crowded with thoughts they had hidden for far too long, and they realized there was only one place where they could finally let those thoughts breathe, not because every answer would suddenly appear, not because every fear would disappear, but because silence had become heavier than truth. So they stepped outside. The air was still, the sky seemed unusually wide. For a long moment, they simply stood there without speaking, as though searching for words that refused to come. Sometimes the hardest conversations begin before a single sentence is spoken. Sometimes the heart must gather courage long before the voice can follow. Pause with this story for another moment, because what happened next became the turning point they never expected. They lifted their eyes toward the morning sky. There was no dramatic sign, no thunder, no extraordinary spectacle, only stillness. Yet within that stillness they whispered words they had never spoken aloud before. Father. That single word carried years of uncertainty. It carried memories, regrets, hope, questions. And one name that had become impossible to remove from their heart, your name. For so long they had convinced themselves they could handle everything alone. They believed emotions became easier if they remained hidden. They thought unanswered questions would eventually fade on their own. Instead, those questions grew stronger. Every ordinary day reminded them of you in unexpected ways. A familiar song, an empty chair, a quiet road, a conversation that suddenly brought back your laughter. No matter how determined they were to move forward without facing their feelings, those reminders continued appearing like gentle invitations they could never completely ignore. This fictional story imagines that, on this particular morning, they finally admitted what they had spent months trying to deny. I still think about them. The word surprised even them. Once spoken, there was no taking them back. For the first time they stopped pretending that your presence had been temporary. They admitted that your influence had quietly changed them, not through grand gestures, not through impossible promises, but through small moments that slowly reshaped the way they understood love, trust, and vulnerability. As the morning breeze moved around them, they continued speaking. I don't even know why they matter so much. They laughed softly at themselves, not because anything felt humorous, but because sometimes the heart reveals truths that the mind has spent months trying to avoid. Every sentence made the next one easier. That is how honesty works. The first truth often unlocks 10 others waiting behind it. They remembered the first conversation you shared, Not because every detail remained perfect, but because they remembered how different they felt afterward. Something inside them had become lighter, safer, more hopeful. At the time they ignored that feeling. Now they understood it had never truly disappeared. It had simply been waiting beneath the surface. Morning sunlight slowly brightened the sky. Birds began filling the silence. The world continued moving as though nothing unusual had happened, yet inside their heart everything was changing, because they were no longer speaking to escape loneliness. They were speaking to understand it. They confessed something they had never admitted to anyone. I was afraid, not afraid of loving. Afraid of losing. There is a difference. One invites closeness. The other builds invisible walls. Throughout this fictional story, that realization becomes more important than either of them could have imagined. They remembered moments when they withdrew even though they wanted to stay, moments when they became quiet because their emotions suddenly felt too large for ordinary conversation. Moments when they convinced themselves distance would somehow make everything easier. It never did. Distance protected nothing. It only postponed honesty. Then another sentence quietly emerged. I wonder if they believed I stopped caring. Those words remained hanging in the morning air. Even they struggled to answer them, because they knew appearances had often suggested exactly that. There were delayed messages, missed opportunities, conversations left unfinished, smiles that concealed uncertainty. Every choice had been influenced by fears they barely understood themselves, yet beneath every hesitation lived one unchanging truth: you mattered, far more deeply than their actions ever managed to communicate. That realization became impossible to ignore, as this fictional tale continues unfolding. Another unexpected memory entered their thoughts. They remembered a moment when you looked at them with complete sincerity, no expectations, no performance. Only genuine presence. At the time they felt seen in a way that unsettled them, not because being understood felt dangerous, because being understood meant they could no longer hide from themselves. They whispered another quiet confession. I don't think they ever realized how much they changed me. The wind carried those words away, yet saying them aloud somehow made them feel more real. The heart has strange ways of revealing truth. Sometimes it waits until dawn, sometimes it waits until silence. Sometimes it waits until pretending becomes more painful than honesty. Then something happened they never anticipated. Instead of asking for certainty, instead of asking for signs, instead of asking for guarantees, they asked for courage. Courage to become honest. Courage to stop allowing yesterday's fears to decide tomorrow's possibilities. Courage to face whatever answer awaited them. That prayer surprised them, because only weeks earlier they would have prayed for protection. Now they were praying for transformation. Growth had quietly begun, yet they still carried one question they could not answer. Should they tell you everything, or had too much? Time already passed. The uncertainty remained, but something else was becoming stronger. Hope, not loud hope, not dramatic hope, steady hope, the kind that grows slowly beneath the surface until one day it becomes impossible to ignore. As the morning continued, they realized another truth. They had spent months trying to understand your heart, yet they had rarely allowed you to understand theirs. That imbalance had created confusion neither of you deserved. Relationships do not weaken only because love disappears. Sometimes they weaken because fear speaks more often than honesty. This realization settled heavily upon them. They closed their eyes. Not searching for extraordinary visions, only searching for enough peace to hear their own heart clearly. Within that quiet moment another sentence finally emerged. If I lose them because I stayed silent, that silence will become my greatest regret. Those words changed everything. Because they transformed waiting into responsibility. No longer could they blame circumstances alone. No longer could they hide behind timing. Every passing day without honesty now felt like a choice, and choices shape stories. Meanwhile, completely unaware of this imagined conversation, your own life continued moving. You carried questions. You searched for meaning. You wondered whether certain moments had mattered as much to them as they had mattered to you. This fictional story gently invites another possibility. Perhaps both hearts were asking similar questions while believing they stood alone. Perhaps both feared becoming vulnerable first. Perhaps both quietly hoped the other still cared. Sometimes love becomes hidden beneath matching fears. Neither person stops feeling, both simply stop speaking. That silence becomes its own language, yet silence was beginning to lose its power, because once the truth had been spoken that morning, even if only into the quiet sky, it refused to return to hiding. Your loved one sensed change approaching. Not because every problem had disappeared, because denial had. And once denial leaves, decisions soon follow. They looked toward the horizon once more. The sunrise now stood fully before them. Its light reached places that moments earlier had remained hidden in shadow. That simple image stayed with them. Perhaps healing works the same way. Not all at once, but gradually, until one day what seemed impossible becomes visible. They smiled faintly, not because every answer had arrived, but because for the first time in a very long while, they had stopped running from the truth. Then they remembered something remarkably small. A conversation the two of you once shared. Most people would have forgotten it. They never did. You had spoken about choosing honesty even when honesty felt uncomfortable. At the time they nodded politely. Only now did they understand what those words truly meant. The memory returned with surprising clarity. And suddenly they realized something that made their heart race. There had been one specific moment. One moment when they almost told you everything. They almost admitted how important you had become. They almost revealed the future they secretly imagined. They almost reached across the distance created by fear. But they stopped, not because the feeling disappeared, because courage did. Now that unfinished moment has begun returning to them again and again, refusing to stay buried in memory. They believe that unfinished sentence still exists somewhere between your hearts, waiting. Patiently, quietly, unspoken. As the morning came to its end, they made one final promise, not to the sky, not to certainty, but to themselves. They would no longer allow fear to speak louder than truth. Yet there remains one confession they have still not found the strength to say aloud. It is the sentence they rehearsed over and over after that morning ended, the sentence that begins with your name, the sentence that could change everything if it is ever spoken. Long after they walked away, those unfinished words continued following them like quiet footsteps they could not outrun. Every ordinary task became interrupted by the same thought. Every familiar place seemed strangely unfamiliar because something inside them had shifted. Once a heart has finally admitted the truth to itself, pretending becomes exhausting. They tried to distract themselves. They answered messages. They smiled at people. They completed responsibilities that demanded their attention. Yet beneath every conversation, another conversation continued unfolding, the one that mattered most, the one they had never allowed you to hear. Again and again they replayed your last meaningful exchange, not because they wished to remain trapped in the past. Because somewhere within that memory they believed they had missed an opportunity they might never receive again. The smallest details suddenly became unforgettable, the pause before you answered, the kindness in your voice, the way you looked away for just a moment, as though carrying your own unspoken emotions. At the time they noticed those moments without understanding them. Now those memories returned carrying entirely different meaning. They whispered to themselves, what if they were waiting for me to be honest? That single question unsettled everything they thought they understood. For so long they assumed silence protected both of you. Now they wondered whether silence had been quietly breaking both hearts instead. As this fictional story continues, another realization begins unfolding. The greatest distance between two people is rarely measured by geography. It is measured by the words that remain trapped inside them. Your loved one began recognizing how many conversations never truly happened. There were messages rewritten before they were sent. Phone calls almost made, apologies rehearsed but never spoken. Confessions interrupted by fear, entire futures postponed because neither heart wanted to risk hearing an answer it could not control. Yet something extraordinary had begun changing inside them, not around them, within them. Fear was losing its authority, slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. The change did not arrive with certainty. It arrived with honesty. And honesty has a remarkable way of transforming everything it touches. That afternoon they found themselves sitting alone once more, no audience, no expectations, only silence. The same silence that once frightened them now invited reflection. They remembered something you once said. Perhaps you don't even remember saying it, perhaps it felt ordinary to you, but certain ordinary sentences become extraordinary when they arrive at exactly the right moment. You had said, real connections deserve real conversations. They smiled, not because the memory erased their uncertainty, because it reminded them what they had been avoiding. Truth, simple, uncomfortable, necessary truth. Their heart answered with another confession. I've spent so much time wondering whether they would understand me that I never stopped to understand what my silence must have felt like to them. Compassion replaced defensiveness. That was new. Instead of protecting their pride, they began protecting your heart. That shift mattered more than they realized, because genuine love rarely begins with demanding to be understood. It matures when someone sincerely wishes to understand another. The day continued. Clouds drifted across the sky. Hours passed almost unnoticed. But every passing hour strengthened one quiet decision. They could no longer leave the story unfinished. Still, one final fear remained. It was deeper than rejection, deeper than embarrassment, deeper than disappointment. They feared discovering they had arrived too late. That fear became almost unbearable. What if they already stopped believing in us? The question echoed through every quiet corner of their thoughts. No answer arrived, only another memory. They remembered the last time they saw genuine disappointment in your eyes. Not anger, not resentment, disappointment, the kind that appears when someone hoped for honesty but received uncertainty instead. That memory stayed with them, not to punish them, to awaken them. For the first time they understood that every delayed truth creates unnecessary distance. Every postponed conversation allows imagination to write stories reality never intended. Every hidden feeling leaves room for misunderstanding, and misunderstanding is patient. It grows wherever clarity is absent. As evening approached, they stood once again beneath the open sky. This time they did not come searching for answers. They came carrying a decision. Their voice was steadier now. I cannot promise perfection. A gentle breeze passed around them. I cannot promise I will never feel afraid. The silence remained peaceful. But I can promise I no longer want fear making choices that belong to love. Those words felt different. They were no longer wishes. They were commitments. Something inside them became lighter. Not because every obstacle had disappeared, because they had finally stopped hiding from themselves. Yet one final revelation waited quietly beneath everything else, a truth they had almost overlooked. It had nothing to do with timing, nothing to do with circumstances, nothing to do with distance. It had everything to do with a single sentence they had never dared to finish. They whispered your name. For a long moment, nothing followed. Then tears quietly gathered in their eyes. Not from sadness alone, from relief. Because saying your name without pretending indifference finally felt honest. And honesty brought peace they had searched for everywhere else. Still, there remains one conversation that has not yet happened. One truth they have not yet placed into your hands. One confession that changes the meaning of everything they believed you understood. It is not the confession they expected to make. It is far more vulnerable than, I miss you, far deeper than, I still care, far more life-changing than, I was afraid. Those words have remained hidden since that unforgettable morning. They have carried them every day since. And when they finally gather enough courage to speak them aloud, the story between your hearts will never sound the same again. It was no longer the silence of avoidance. It was the silence that comes just before a long-awaited truth is finally spoken. Your loved one awoke with the same thought that had followed them through the previous day. They tried to push it aside. They told themselves to focus on ordinary responsibilities. They convinced themselves that another day of waiting would somehow make the conversation easier. It did not. Some conversations become heavier the longer they remain hidden, others quietly become impossible to ignore. As the hours passed, They realized they were no longer deciding whether to speak, they were only deciding how much longer fear would delay the inevitable. The difference mattered. For the first time, they stopped asking, "What if everything changes?" Instead they asked, "What if nothing changes because I never speak?" That question echoed through every quiet corner of their thoughts. It followed them through familiar streets. It remained beside them during ordinary conversations. It returned every time your name entered their mind, and your name entered their mind far more often than they admitted. This fictional story imagines that, somewhere deep inside, they had already made their choice long before they found the courage to act upon it. The heart often arrives before the voice does. That afternoon they opened an old conversation, not to send anything, only to remember. They slowly reread words exchanged months earlier, simple words, ordinary words. Yet hidden between those ordinary sentences they suddenly noticed something extraordinary. You had always been consistent. Even when confused, even when uncertain, even when disappointed, your kindness had remained. That realization humbled them. They whispered softly, "They gave me honesty, and I answered with hesitation." The sentence lingered, not as self-condemnation, as awakening, because growth begins the moment excuses lose their power. For several minutes they simply stared at the screen. Their fingers moved toward the keyboard, then stopped, moved again, stopped once more, not because they lacked feelings, because genuine words deserve courage, and courage is sometimes built one breath at a time. Meanwhile, another memory quietly surfaced. It was not your first meeting, not your last conversation. It was something far smaller, a moment when both of you laughed without thinking, no expectations, no uncertainty, no hidden fears, just peace. They smiled through unexpected tears. That was the moment they understood what they had truly been grieving, not the possibility of rejection, the possibility of losing the version of themselves that existed whenever they were with you. You had not simply entered their life, you had reminded them of who they wanted to become. That realization changed everything, because suddenly,